Good morning. I'm Dr. Katurah Jenkins-Hall.
Hi, I'm Reverend J.C. Pritchett II.
And we're here to talk about HIV/AIDS in Black women, and also particularly Black women in the church, and what the church can do about it, what our community can do about it. I have read, JC, that most of our issues with HIV/AIDS are primarily with Black and Latino males, same gender relationships. But of all of the women affected with HIV and AIDS, 60% of them are African Americans. That's really high. What do you think the church should be doing about that?
You know, that's a sad stat. You know, most of us this week watched the Black Church documentary that Professor Henry Louis Gates had, and we saw how since arriving here as enslaved people, African Americans found a way. And so the faith community has to have a response to this epidemic, when we know that our congregations are made up primarily of African American women. And so we have information that says that these African American women are most affected in our faith community by these new cases.
Yeah, and you brought up an important point that most of our churches are, would you say 90% African American women, at least 80% women?
Yeah, you know, if we are honest about aunts and mothers and big mamas and muddies that got us ready on Saturday for worship on Sunday and who are the foundation of most of our homes, they're the ones in the church who raise money and do ministry and support and cook meals and teach Sunday school and have been the solid rock of the church from the beginning of our arrival here. And so it's our church. It's these women, these sisters, these ladies who make up our faith communities.
Yeah, and I agree. I happen to be a Black faith leader who is female, but most of my peers are male. And so we have a situation where we're reliant on our brothers to give messages to the women about their health conditions, particularly HIV and AIDS. How difficult is that for you as a male faith leader to do that?
You know, that is one of the challenges of this work, is that if we aren't educating ourselves, are sensitive about the crisis that is before us, and we do not act, then we are morally irresponsible. So last year, the COVID-19 struck our churches, our communities. We acted. We did mass donations. We raised money. We found creative ways to worship. If we are people of faith, and for those of us who follow the Jesus model, when Jesus finds crisis and conflict, he acts. And so whenever I am confronted by maybe a moderate or a conservative, or maybe a faith leader who really wants to understand more, I go to the text, the sacred text that is embraced by our community. And any time you hear Jesus talking, and I can elaborate later on more, anytime you find Jesus talking, he's trying to find a place where there's hurt and there's sickness and there's disappointment, and he responds. You know, he says to us when he in the text where he separates the sheep from the wolves. He says, "When I was sick, you saw about me. When I was in prison, you visited me. When I was thirsty, you gave me drink. When I was hungry, you fed me." That's who we represent. That's who we are. And I like to see what you're thinking about this, Doc, because we have let white evangelicals change the language and the posture of the church the past few years, and has created a false image of what the Church of Jesus is. That the white privilege and white supremacy and grasping for power is not Jesus, and it's not the church. The church is a Jesus saying, "I'm hungry, let's find a way to feed people.
Right.
I'm in prison, let's find a way to visit people. I'm thirsty, let's find a way to give people a drink." And Jesus would say, during a pandemic, you respond. Jesus would also say, when we find out that our sisters are being affected by this horrible disease, that we respond.
I love what you're saying, because the ministry of Jesus Christ is really a social justice ministry, right? And so we have to look after our sick among us. Jesus didn't come for those who are well, he came for the sick. I think one of the things that blocks us from having these really important conversations, I love the comparison you did with COVID-19. We had no problem with COVID-19, but the stigma around HIV/AIDS has as its basis something to do with sexuality. And I don't know about you, but I find that the church is reluctant to speak directly about sexuality, or it's in somewhat denial. So everybody is mandated to live pure lives. Nobody is perfect in that area, and that's what we don't want to face. And so people are having sex.
Yeah. Again, I try to go to the text and then to work to the problem. And those who bring up sexuality or something that they find immoral, immediately when you go to Jesus at the well, the conversation that he has with the Samaritan woman is that she says to him, I'm a Samaritan woman and you're a Jew, and Jews do not have any relationships with Samaritans.
Right.
And Jesus knows that he's dealing with a woman who has an issue. She has a sex issue. She has an issue with relationships. But he does not disrespect her. He does not walk away from her. He embraces her. He embraces someone that is different. And so the sister has enough about her to know, and enough awareness to know that this is really strange. This doesn't happen.
Right.
A Jewish man having a conversation out in the public at the well with a Samaritan woman. Jesus engages her. They have dialogue at the well, and that's the example of what we must do with the other. We love to talk about the other and what's different. But the other and what's different is where Jesus comes in and says, there's an otherness, there's a differentness. We don't all agree, but what can we do together? How can we build alliances, collaborations, and partner together in order to create a different world? And that's anytime you find Jesus dealing with a crisis, he immediately gives us something to learn from.
I love it. I love it because, as you were saying that, I was reminded of Jesus with the woman with the issue of blood. And I'm also reminded of Jesus with the woman with the issue of blood, for example. Jesus, the whole community is concerned with impurity. So they shut her out. They alienate her. Jesus invites her. He's not ashamed or afraid or disgusted by her impurities. He embraces her and calls her daughter, and he heals her. And that's the model we need to be aware of and concerned about. Part of the reason that women in general, not just in the church, they don't come forth, is because of the shame and the stigma around this disease. It is a sure sign to the world that somehow they've been impure. Either they've been with somebody who uses drugs, either they themselves use needles, or they've been, they've been sexually immoral in some way. And that's a problem that I will get as a psychologist on my end. But even as a psychologist, I don't have many women coming forth with things like STDs or HIV/AIDS. They don't talk freely about that. And I believe that it's on us to create the right space for that to happen.
It's very interesting that the church has been shut down for 12 months. And maybe when the church opens back up, we will stop hurting people.
Wow.
And so whether you deal with the Catholic Church, which has spent millions of dollars hiding abuse of young people, millions of dollars. Some parishes have had to close down because they're going bankrupt, hiding sexuality, hiding, abusing, not confronting this body, this temple that God gave us. Our organization lifted up John 13:34 as a text for the work we're going to do in this HIV/AIDS epidemic space. in the faith community, in that text says that Jesus gives us a new commandment. He gives us a commandment that says to love your neighbor as you love yourself. So we have to go to loving yourself. Do you love yourself? Are you secure? Are you secure about who you are, where you're going, this temple that God gave you, mind, body, soul? And then you have to love your neighbor. Who is your neighbor? That's the question for America today.
Yes.
This Tea Party stuff, this Trump stuff, the January 6th stuff. Who is your neighbor? Is your neighbor someone who flees across a border of fleeing persecution to find safety, and you lock their children up in cages?
Wow.
Is your neighbor someone that has a different interest in who they love than you? Or is your neighbor just the people who think like you, look like you, and love like you? And so if you love yourself and you love your neighbor, how you approach the bedroom, the most intimate, sacred place, as a lover. Are you respectful of your lover? Are you intimate with your lover? Do you protect your lover? Are you honest with your lover? These are all the things that come out of a faith community. The faith community should be teaching love, respect, dignity, being honest, being truthful, being intimate. You know, I love when Men's Day comes around. I always teach this text that rattles men, where Jesus in John is relaxing with those he loves, and John says, as he writes this, that he laid in Jesus' lap. That gets people who are homophobic and who are insecure about their sexuality, and insecure about their masculinity, and insecure about what it is that you do when you fall in love and you want to act on those emotions. But Jesus is comfortable enough in his manhood and his masculinity and his personhood to in his last moments before he leaves this earth, to embrace a same gender man that he loves in a moment of intimacy and of friendship that is the love of your neighbor, like you love yourself.
Right, right. So when I hear you say, you know, this new commandment I give you, the first commandment, it said, love the Lord with all your heart, your mind, your spirit, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. But this new commandment, because the love your neighbor as yourself is an assumption of self-love. But this new commandment is love one another as I love you. Because we don't do good with loving ourselves. We don't love ourselves enough. There's an assumption of self-love. So, but that assumption is not always right. And so sometimes by not loving ourselves enough, if we can't love ourselves, we can't possibly form intimate relationships with others in the way that we should. So Jesus is our model. If you're a Christian, Jesus is your model. It's a great model. It's a great model for how to take care of self, others, and the reverence that's given to God. Yet we are reluctant in some areas. We're reluctant to have the conversations. At my church, I've offered to singles, and we've had over 75 singles in the class from a book called Soul Virgins. This idea of how to embrace your sexuality and still be a Christian. When you become a Christian, the light switch doesn't turn off. And so singles want to know, what happens when I'm surging? What happens when the urge is there and I don't know how to deal with my body, my temple? That's the home of the Holy Spirit. What happens to me? And we have to have the people available to give those kinds of answers. One of the other things that I'm curious about, I don't know if you've heard anything about this, is I'm hearing that people are having all kind of hookups during this COVID-19 season, not being as discriminate as they might. We know that one way to prevent HIV/AIDS is to get tested and not to be with a partner until you see or know the test results or that they are safe. But I'm hearing there's a lot of unsafe sex going on in the midst of this isolation.
You know, again, the Black Church documentary lifted up Howard Thurman, who was new to a lot of people, but not new to many of us clergy. And so I looked at something that he wrote, and I wanted to share it from Jesus and the Disinherited, because there's a word that's very important for us as faith leaders in addressing this HIV/AIDS epidemic, and that word is obligation. Listen to what Dr. Thurman says. The religion of Jesus makes the love ethic central. This is no ordinary achievement. It seems clear that Jesus started out with a simple teaching concerning love embodied in the timeless words of Israel, which you mentioned, quote, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy might," end of quote. And quote again, "and thy neighbor as thyself," end of quote. Once the neighbor is defined, then one's moral obligation is clear. Once we identify who our neighbor is, there's an obligation and responsibility. And many of us don't want to take on, this is Drake, and I'm very old, so it's dated. Drake said, "No new friends." But once we identify our neighbor, there's an obligation and a responsibility and a duty that goes with that. And so the church has to have this realization that we travel. Many of us have been to seminary or have received other training. We go to conventions and workshops every year. We have large libraries. We get the information that many of our people don't have access to. We have an obligation and responsibility and a duty to mention during quarantine, this is what's going on. This is how to protect yourself. This is how to keep yourself safe. That you can go to Metro or Epic or some other place to get help. It's a big deal. It's a big responsibility to have to share with membership what's going on in the bedroom, or what's going on in health, or what's going on with finances. There's so many areas that we have. It's a calling to fulfill.
Right.
So you have to help people with finances, in medicine, in science, in sex, in love, and having your heart broken, in grief, in mourning. We just can't take on a responsibility partially and say, well, we're going to leave out that part. And I think you and I talked about this before. After this pandemic, we were exposed as a church. We didn't have an infrastructure in place. Many of us couldn't operate for 1 month without offerings coming in. Many of us could not make the adaptation to preaching or teaching on streaming services. And that the millennials had told us before, they questioned whether we were relevant, whether we were important. They've been telling us they love Jesus, they love God, but I don't love that church thing that hurts people and that does not talk about love or sex or same gender loving people. And I think we got a big responsibility when we come out of this to see what kind of church we're going to be.
What I hear you saying, Reverend, is to not respond to these social issues is an indication that our faith leaders are being immoral. And so it is just so interesting to me that the morality issue that keeps them from responding, keeps them judging others' morals, rather than looking, I say them, I should say us from looking inside ourselves to say, who is the immoral one? The one who has sex or the one who refuses to help when a crisis is at hand?
Yeah. So during COVID-19, there were food lines, blocks and blocks of food lines because people needed to get groceries. And when you see someone who needs food or water, again back to the Jesus text, you respond. And you said something that brought up, again, while we can't be hypocrites, and we have to have these honest conversations about our body, how it works, myths and lies about our body, about sex, about being in love, about having your heart broken. I mean, we have a responsibility, but so there's the text that you probably preached about before, and I have too, that the woman is caught in the act of adultery.
Right.
And caught in the act means somebody's got their nasty self in the room. But the most important thing for me is that they have the woman and the man is gone.
Right.
So when, in the text, whenever there is a question about the bedroom, someone is hurt, and it's usually the most vulnerable person who is hurt or oppressed. So the woman is guilty, the woman is going to be punished, and the man flees. Again, that's a different context and a different history and a different time, but it's so relevant today. And so the Luke text about the Good Samaritan is the same thing. It's that someone has been robbed and beaten, left dying on the side of the road. The priest or the church comes by and they go across on the other side. The Levite comes by, he crosses on the other side. And it's the Good Samaritan who didn't have the contacts or the resources or the fancy degrees who stopped to see about the man who was dying on the side of the road. What is the church's response? And this is what is so hurtful about this. And again, I don't know how you feel as a sister hearing this way, but I would say and preach this way for a reason. We are doing it to our mamas and our sisters and our grandmothers and our deaconesses and our choir members. That's who we're hurting when we look at the numbers that say in the faith community of an African American community that it's those numbers that are the new cases. So we don't have compassion or sensitivity or a health ministry created or response when our sisters are dying. And I mean, if I was going to preach, I would say, oh, what we owe our sisters. Wow. Stacey Abrams, Vice President Harris, who have done the work that saved us in the political system, who have saved our families, who have kept our churches alive. We've survived through the women who we have turned our back on when we are silent and we come up with excuses on how not to respond. And we're just as guilty as the priest and the Levite who crossed the other side of the road.
That's well said, my brother. We have to really be devoted to giving messages to both men and women as to how to conquer this HIV/AIDS pandemic. I'm going to call it a pandemic. It is serious. It starts with educating ourselves about the disease. It continues with introspection, examining ourselves for our homophobia that gets translated and moralized and transferred to what's going on with women as well, that causes them shame. And we have to promote testing. We have to promote getting tested. People don't get tested because they don't want to know if they're HIV positive. Why? Because it will change their worlds. It will change their worlds in their minds. It will lead to discrimination. It will lead to isolation. It will lead to some type of judgment on the part of people who care most about them. We've got to do our part to create the safety in our community, in our spaces, so that people would get tested as part of a normal way of being. If I'm going to have sex, then I get tested because it's a responsible thing to do. It is the responsible thing to do.
Something you mentioned that came to my attention talking to some women is that even when they go for their annual physical, you have to ask to get an HIV/AIDS test. It's not part of your physical with your doctor. You have to request it. And so when we talk about testing, on one hand, we're dealing with the African American women who make up most of our churches, but on the other hand, we have to talk about the younger men, black and brown men, who are the newest cases. So we have to have unique ways, A, for testing to be available to them, locations to be available for those tests, and a support system. Counselors that look like them, that understand their history, the environment that they live in, so that if there is a new case, that we are supportive. So we have to test, we have to protect, but we also have to be supportive. And so that's going to have to be something unique that for the church maybe we have to really step out of our walls, because we don't have those young men in most of our churches. And so we have to identify, we have to educate, and then when testing is done, we have to make sure that we have a support system for them. But the other thing is we have to have grown folks conversations about what is a man, what is being responsible, how do you treat a lover, how do you protect yourself, how do you protect not only yourself but your lover, how are you responsible? That the true warriors, all these images that people love, these warrior, these kings. You're a king And you're a warrior when you respect your lover, when you respect yourself, when you protect yourself, when you protect your lover, when you have a responsibility for what you do in the bedroom. And we as a faith community, especially those of us who are men, have to have conversations about the words we don't use. We have to talk masturbation. We have to have conversations about condoms. We have to have conversations about STIs. We have to have conversations about the responsibility that goes with having sex. And if we do not have these conversations with these young people about having sex and being responsible, when we open back up after COVID-19, this horrible pandemic, when we open back up, no one's coming our way because we have again shown that we are hypocrites, we are frauds, we are irrelevant, and we won't deliver. And that's going to be a sad indictment of the church. The white folks have already shown us their love of Trump and of white supremacy and white privilege. They've already shown us how to abuse the sacred text in what Jesus has asked us to do. The black church now has responsibility to come out of this different, not hurtful, not harmful, not hating, not irrelevant. And that's a challenge.
I agree.